Hello, everyone. My name is James Briner, and you're watching Your News Biz, where we talk about how independent news media can develop viable business models. And as I like to say, today is another day of opportunity. And our opportunity today is to talk with Damian Radcliffe. He's a journalist, researcher, professor based at the University of Oregon. He holds the Chambers Chair in Journalism and is a professor of practice, an affiliate faculty member of the Department for Middle East and North Africa Studies, which is called MENA, and the Agora Journalism Center, which we're going to hear about today. And he's a research associate of the Center for Science Communication Research. He's an expert on digital media trends, social media, technology, the business of media, evolution of present day journalistic practice, and the role played by media and technology in the Middle East. And I've been following Damian's work for a number of years now. But before we get into journalism, Damian, I thought I'd love to hear how somebody got from over on the other side of the pond to the US. And tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, thank you, James, for reaching out and connecting. Similarly, I've been following your work and admiring it for a very long time. So it's really nice to have the opportunity to connect and to chat. And my route here, I mean, I'm just coming up to my 10th year here in the US. I'm not sure if that British accent is still holding strong or not, but it really came about
Well,
via.
it's strong.
It's strong. Okay. It's not with my kids who just sound very American, but with me and my wife, maybe it's still being preserved. But our route here was kind of an unexpected one. I spent most of my life living and working in the UK. I moved to the Middle East in 2012 for 3 years, the year after the Arab Spring, to report on the impact of digital technologies on society within both the MENA region and also globally. And then we were really thinking about, well, what might we want to do next? And I saw an opportunity come up here at the University of Oregon, which I felt was a moonshot, but sometimes you just have to go for those moonshots. And fortuitously, I'm going to sound like Sally Field when she won her Oscar. They liked me, I liked them, and so we ended up moving here in September of 2015. And unseen, we had a 5-month-old baby at the time. My wife had never been to this part of the US, but we just took what felt like a calculated risk to come out here for a couple of years. And here we are a decade on, and this is our home, and we love being here.
That's great. Um, so what are you working on right now? You were talking a little bit about the Agora project. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate that I work with my colleagues at the Agora Journalism Center, which is based in Portland, Oregon. It's the biggest city in the state, about 120 miles north of where we are here in Eugene. It's cold in Eugene. I've just dashed in to do this interview, which is why I'm still wearing a scarf as I warm up. And the Agora Journalism Center has really focused on looking at engagement, particularly through sort of civic engagement and innovation in journalism. And then over the last couple of years has pivoted to looking more at local news and local journalism with those sensibilities shot through them, and how we develop a more sustainable local news ecosystem within Oregon, our home state, but also across the US and indeed beyond. And I've been fortunate that I've done a number of projects for them over the years, the most recent of which has been 2 reports looking at community-centered journalism, talking a little bit about the principles and ideas about what that is, how it differs from more traditional forms of journalism, why we need to do journalism differently, and what that might look like. So that's been some of the most recent work that I have done and published for them, and I can tell you what I have in the pipeline for them as well in due course.
Well, I've read the report. Maybe to be perfectly honest, I skimmed parts of it.
That's
But
okay.
at the end, there were 10 basic recommendations about community-centered journalism having to do with listening and creating a news agenda based on what the community itself wants. I don't know if you have those 10 things memorized, but you can certainly talk about those things in general, I'm sure.
Yes, I mean the key thing that we're really trying to encourage people to think about when we're talking about community-centered journalism is to think about moving away from the traditional top-down approach to journalism, where a group of people in a newsroom, usually white, middle-aged, college-educated men, determine this is the news, this is the information you need to know, and we're going to serve it to you in the manner that we think is best. And to really tip that whole model on its head and say, actually, we need to, as you said, listen a lot more to communities, work with them to understand what their information needs are in terms of the materials they need to flourish and survive in their day-to-day lives, and indeed also what are the best ways to deliver this. And that might not be a traditional 800-word news article. It might be delivered in entirely different formats. Um, and in some cases, I've got some examples I've included in the report where actually it's not even a question of reporting that communities are looking for, but actually just aggregated information and resources. Where do I go to find out about X? How do I do more about Y? This landscape is really confusing. Can you, as a trusted agent, help me navigate this space so that I know how to move forward and to address these issues? And so
It's,
those are really the kind of core parts of that community-centered approach is to say, we don't know best as journalists. The community does, and our job is to work in partnership and in service to them to support the needs that they have and that they express to us.
the comment you made about aggregating information. Sometimes I was working with a newspaper, a printed newspaper in Belarus a number of years ago, and when they launched their website, one of the most popular, no, not one of the most, the most popular web page on their page on their website was the bus schedules because they had several different companies provided bus service, and there was no place that sort of integrated it all together. And
Right.
another example of that is El Toque in Cuba, which publishes daily exchange rates for the dollar versus the Cuban peso, and not only what's the official rate, but what's the going rate on the street? What are the black market rates for the peso versus the dollar and so on? And that is one of the most popular parts of their website. So yes, as you say, aggregating information that's useful to people and that maybe not considered traditional news as we the editors would deem it.
Yes, and yeah, and also interestingly, those examples you've given are fascinating because historically, this is what local journalism has always done and what local journalists have always done. So in the days when newsrooms had a kind of a visible shop front in the middle of the town rather than on an industrial estate miles away or even being produced from 40, 50 miles away from outside the location that they are supposedly reporting on, we would always have walk-ins with people who had random questions that they wanted help with. You'd answer the phone, and somebody would be asking you the very kind of questions that you've just shared, and they would almost use the newspaper. We're not just talking about newspapers. It's also all forms of local media, but particularly local newspapers, I think, as an information directory, because the sense was, if I don't know where to get this information, but the people who will are the local journalists, and as we have seen the economic model of journalism and in particular local journalism change, I believe that a lot of those local ties have been lost, and that the proximity to the audience that we have historically seen in local journalism has become more reduced with every passing year. And we need to find ways to reconnect and to be more visible and engaged with communities. And so obviously the reports offer some examples of how different outlets across the country are doing that, and also some principles that can underpin that approach as well.
Now, I noticed just today or yesterday on Press Gazette that there's a new London based news website that's coming out, and they state as their main goal to provide information on all, is it 40 boroughs of London, and
Mm-hmm.
to focus on the local, what's going on in those local boroughs rather than the big national picture, which everybody does. Have you
Yeah,
seen?
and a lot of those examples are also newsletter led as well. So if you look at things like in Edinburgh, there's a really great example of that that's been running for a little while by Michael McLeod, and a few others across parts of the UK, where content that would traditionally have sat on a website or being part of a print publication is being delivered to people's inbox and in a newsletter format. And clearly that not only reaches audiences where they are, but is in a format that they find useful. And to that London example, that's a great example of as somebody who spent most of their adult life living and working in London. It's really hard to know what's going on in your own backyard, and the kind of traditional paper of record, the Evening Standard, has just got cut back and back and back. Every time I go back to London, it is a thinner and thinner publication, and there's very little about what's going on in specific boroughs. It feels very, very generic.
And what kinds of, are there any sort of, I hate to say national, but well, let's say that sort of national efforts to to support local news in the US. I think the American Journalism Project is supporting some things, and what are some others that
Yeah,
you've seen?
and Press Forward is another similar initiative. I mean, what's been really interesting in this space, and this is actually the next project I'm going to be working on for the Agora Journalism Centre, is the shift that we have seen in terms of the conversation from how to create a sustainable commercial model for local news to recognizing that maybe there is no successful commercial model, that the future is non-profit. And I've done work surveying local journalists where overwhelmingly that they see that as the future as being non-profit, and where philanthropic funding is already playing a more significant part in the funding of local news and local journalism, and where the trajectory suggests that that will only continue. And that is a big sea change. The pandemic, for example, enabled a number of different community foundations that hadn't historically seen journalism as a suitable vehicle to support some of their goals and aims, recognized, oh, actually, if we're a health-based community foundation and we want to reach hard to reach communities and get vital life-saving health information to them, partnering with a local media outlet enables us to do that. We've seen other examples, particularly here in Oregon, where we unfortunately have a large homeless and unhoused population and many issues with that. It's a real staple of a lot of the local news reporting that we see here, and foundations who are working in that space to make a difference are partnering increasingly with local media outlets, including funding specific roles for journalists to cover that beat for a 2 or 3 year period, guaranteeing that funding to ensure that a spotlight continues to be shone on that issue, that success stories are highlighted, but also we don't shy away from the very real issues that need to be addressed and tackled. And that's super interesting because when I first moved here and I brought very strong European sensibilities in terms of attitudes towards public funding for journalism and news media, which weren't really shared with many of the people that I spoke to and talked to, and people saw a real conflict of interest between, well, we're an NGO that supports homelessness and addresses homelessness issues. If we give you funding for a role that there's going to be a conflict of interest there, how are you going to be able to critically comment on the work that we do and some of the issues that we maybe are not addressing? And that has changed over the course of the last decade. There's a much greater willingness to accept money from philanthropic and other organizations, and a recognition that actually those things don't have to be in conflict with one another.
Right. Well, in Cleveland, where I'm living now, the Cleveland Foundation big foundation, is supporting something called Signal, Signal News and Signal Ohio. They're also getting a lot of non
Mhm.
foundation support. And really, the European sensibility of news and information as a public service rather than as a business. I mean, that goes back to the BBC. The
Yeah.
BBC is probably the worldwide best example of news and information as a public service paid for out of public funds. And it was a great model. But yes, in the US, we like to privatize everything. And so the recognition that news and information are public service is very difficult. The parallel with our healthcare system, we still look at healthcare as a business, or we treat it as a business,
Mhm.
which makes for all kinds of problems, but that's another story. Um,
Yeah.
you mentioned a couple of specific examples uh, of the public service rather than a business, and we're seeing the walls come down between editorial and a business side or a revenue side. That creates sometimes some ethical issues. And would you like to explore that a little bit?
Yes, I mean the traditional church and state boundaries do feel a lot more blurred now in a number of cases, and in local newsrooms, that has probably always been the case. It's just much more explicit now, particularly when we look at mom and pop publications, so outlets that might have literally just one or two staff producing a weekly publication, and in those kind of environments. You are the editor, you are the chief reporter, you are the person who does the sales. You're also the cleaner, and you do literally everything in that in the building. So those kinds of boundaries, I think, had always been blurred, but there's a much kind of greater recognition of that now, and perhaps more comfort with that, or sort of willingness to accept that reality. I mean, I'm curious about whether many of the philosophical objections that we've seen in the past that have started to go away, whether that's because people's philosophical approaches have changed or whether it's actually just more expedient. And I feel it's the latter, that there is a recognition of, well, if we want journalism to survive, we have to perhaps have slightly more fluid church state boundaries. We have to look at accepting funding from sources that historically we might have turned away or felt uncomfortable with, but also recognizing that there are models that you can look at that show how you can do this in a way that is still ethical, that still does preserve boundaries, and most importantly, communicates to the audience. This is what's happening. This is where our money is coming from. This is how we are funded. And I believe that's a really important part of the piece, because there's Pew Research from a few years ago that shows there's a massive disconnect between the financial realities in local journalism and how the public think local journalism is doing. The public overwhelmingly thinks local journalism is in rude health, whereas anyone inside the industry knows the opposite is very true. So there needs to be a much greater job done of communicating those financial realities and the consequences of that in terms of reporting or where money is coming from and so forth. And in just the same way as um, when we look at what's happening with AI and journalism, the same thing, that there needs to be much greater conversation and with our audiences about how these technologies are being used and the implications of that, and a much greater uh, volume of both labeling, but also work to promote the media literacy of audiences by actually sharing what we do and how and why we do it.
Yeah. And I think again, from sort of the top-down view of journalism schools in the past, and to some extent continuing today, the idea, I think you mentioned it in the Agora report, the idea of saving journalism means nothing to the general public. They're not interested in saving journalism. They just want trustworthy information. They want something they can read and then trust and then use to act on in their everyday lives. So there is, as you say, a big disconnect between what people perceive to be the strength of news media and and the reality. Yeah. It
Yes,
used to be a good business. Journalism used to be a very
right.
good business in the US. It's not a very good business anymore.
No, I mean the days of 30% profit margins and so forth are long gone, pretty much everywhere. And I think this is another example of where I do believe the pandemic led to a sea shift of sorts, because when we saw advertising markets drop out pretty much overnight, almost everywhere, there was a much greater willingness for news outlets to talk about the consequences of this, to ask for donations, to set up membership models, to really diversify their revenue sources because they had to. And as part of that, talk about the consequences of, well, if we're not here, if you don't fund this, here is what you will lose and what you will miss out on. And in the past, we'd almost been a little bit too gentlemanly, I think, about those conversations. It felt a little unseemly to talk about money with our audiences. But I do believe there is now a much greater willingness to have those conversations, and particularly frame it around the financial realities, and to emphasize, well, if we're not here, here's what you will lose out on as a result.
Right. And here's our fundraising campaign. If we can raise $50,000, we can hire another reporter or something like that.
Yes.
Um, Speaking of hiring reporters, what do you tell journalism and communication students who are, and more importantly, their parents about what are the realities of the job market? What do you tell them?
I'm so glad you mentioned the parents because I think that's actually a really vital conversation for students to have, because so many of our students, when I ask the students, what do you want to do when you graduate? Where do you want to go? Many of them will say, oh, I want to be a beat reporter covering education for this paper. And it's like, oh, okay, great. Do you read that paper? No. Are you interested in education? Not really. Okay, so why do you want to do that? And I think they feel that's the answer that they should give, and that is probably the answer that they give over Thanksgiving to their parents and extended family, rather than saying, well, actually, what I really want to do is cover uh, esports for such and such a site because I'm really into that, and the people that they're talking to have no idea what that thing is. But what I try to encourage students to do is to recognize that yes, the economic model is very challenging, but there are also more possibilities for us as journalists, as storytellers, as content creators than there ever have been. And that's also incredibly exciting, and I think a real source for optimism. And so I encourage them to follow their passions, their interests, the things that they watch, listen to, and read. That's the place you should want to work. And if there are places that aren't doing the kinds of things that speak to you, could you potentially do something yourself? Could you be entrepreneurial and set up your own business or work as an independent reporter? And more of our students are doing that, or they're doing that as a side hustle because actually their day job in this space doesn't pay enough to make rent and car payments and to have the kind of life that they want and deserve. So a lot of them are kind of hustling, and so we talk a lot about kind of hustle culture, freelancing, and a recognition that there's no set career path anymore, that you determine your own future and the direction of travel. The days of starting at your local paper, then going up to a metro and then to a national are gone, or of joining a company and being with them for 20, 30, 40 years, and then taking responsibility for the development of your career and your skills are also obsolete. That you have to be your own best advocate, and you have to try and stay one step ahead of the curve in terms of whatever is coming down the line in terms of technology, changes in audience consumption and habits and preferences, and really lean into that so that you can be ahead of the curve if and when cuts come or when new opportunities arise, you can be at the front of the queue, the front of the line, because you have that knowledge and skill set that others don't, and that is your competitive advantage.
I did want to talk with you a little bit about something I shared with you in the email before this conversation about pink slime and how there are actually national movements that include thousands, literally thousands of local news publications that are attempting to appear to be trustworthy, reliable sources of news and information, but are actually pushing very specific political agendas, and they're financed by um, big money backers of political agendas, and in particular, conservative agendas, because a lot of people feel that the major media that dominate the markets in Washington, Los Angeles, Hollywood, New York, that those folks do not say anything or do not represent the people in many of these small towns that have lost their newspapers. So um, I'm a little worried. I'm actually an optimist normally, but I'm a little worried about the power of AI to generate what appears to be uh, a story, and how these new news outlets, which are called pink slime. Well, maybe you can tell our audience
Mhm.
what is pink slime, or what's your understanding of pink slime?
Oh, that's a great question. I probably have to Google a definition of it, but I think you've
Well,
encapsulated it. I think you've encapsulated it very, very well. That
okay,
that
well
this
then
is
we'll go on then.
yeah, that this is content that looks at first glance like legitimate news and information, but as you say, is often pushing a partisan agenda. Um, will look like it's being produced for a specific community, but actually, in many cases, there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of sites dotted all across the US that are pushing the exact same stories, that has exactly the same look and feel and design. And one of the reasons why these sites can be so successful in terms of reaching audiences is that in many cases they are targeting news deserts, areas that are devoid of fresh news and information, and where there is a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. And these pink slime sites are able to dock into that, and it's not necessarily obvious when you first look at these sites that they do have an editorial agenda, that the information that they are pushing may not be correct or accurate, or may be highly biased. And the standard thing that we would say to folks would be, well, double check or triple check your sources. But if you're in a news desert, there is no other source to go to.
Right.
Your sources are friends, family. They're the person you have a conversation with at Dollar General or Walmart or on Main Street. Um, so it's very easy to see why these sites can flourish, because they are tapping into audience spaces where there is an audience need, and where it's really, really hard to potentially counteract this through fact checking or other mechanisms that we would historically encourage people to do.
Yeah. Are you worried?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think we all should be. And it really kind of points to why there needs to be more investment in journalism writ large, but particularly at a local level, and not just in terms of the production of news and information, but where we also need to be working with audiences to help them in terms of their news literacy, their ability to spot misinformation and disinformation online, which is only becoming more sophisticated, as you said, through AI and by the day. And also where the business models for a lot of journalism now exclude many people who would most need and benefit from it. Accessing quality news and information behind a paywall is expensive. And I remember talking to a former student who was an editor of a weekly paper about 20 miles south of here, and she said, families are having to make the decision of, do I fill up my car with gas, or do I take out a subscription to our paper? those are the kinds of decisions people are having to weigh up. And we don't see, I think, enough innovation in terms of subscription models in particular to support people who are on lower incomes or are in news deserts who can't necessarily afford to access some news and information. Um, and therefore they're gravitating towards free sources, understandably, and those free sources are not necessarily reliable or accurate.
Right. So, with that, to wrap this up, what do you see? Maybe we've already talked about this, but what do you see as the biggest opportunities today for independent news media? Um, it's a big question.
Yeah, that is a that is a big question, and I don't know if I've drunk enough coffee to be able to answer it at this point. I mean, I think there's a number of factors. I mean, one is we are seeing a greater willingness and awareness of the need to pay for content writ large. So, be that subscriptions for streaming services, for TV, movies, music, and indeed for kind of journalism and other forms of content. I do think there has been a shift in terms of people's willingness to pay for content from where we were at, say, 10 years ago. And that there is more innovation in this space as well. Not enough, as I suggested, but when you see the emergence of independent creators using platforms like Patreon and so forth as ways to generate revenues and to engage with audiences, I think that shows us some interesting potential. And for me, a lot of the most interesting stuff, and where I think there is the biggest area for growth, is really around niche media. That we have so much commodity content, the same story everywhere with very, very little variation and variance. I think that through AI, we will just see more of that, more of just repurposing of press releases and kind of other content so that there's very little differentiation for a lot of the material that we see across multiple sites and platforms. And those that will flourish and succeed will be the people who are doing something different, something distinctive, valuable, really meeting community needs, be that a local community or a community of interest, and doing that in a variety of different places, from YouTube channels to Discord conversations to WhatsApp groups to newsletters. There's so many different ways in which you can serve those audiences, but you have to be doing something that is really valuable and unique. And if you do that, I do believe that audiences will pay for that content.
Yes, I totally agree with that in terms of differentiation, because there is way too much commodity coverage of national politics, for example.
Yes.
And unique content, information that you can't get anywhere else. So the audiences, as you say, are going to be smaller in very narrowly defined niches. We used to say niches in the US. Now we say niches.
Thank you.
Uh, uh, and though that's where the opportunities lie. And in fact, that's was my newspaper background, working for small weekly business publications, all focused on local content that they couldn't, the local businesses that they couldn't get from the big metropolitan dailies. And that was a niche well defined 40 years ago, and it continues today. So at any rate, with that, uh, I thought we would wrap it up. And thank you very much, Damian, for taking the time. I know you're way busier than I am with teaching,
Thank you.
especially teaching gobs of students. I know what that's like. So my thanks to you for making the time for us today.
Thanks so much, James. So great to chat with you.
I know.